Welcome back. My name is Shaun Donovan. I am, other than a former bureaucrat, housing secretary, budget director in the Obama administration, housing commissioner in New York City, the most important thing you can know about me is that I was an intern at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. Yeah. As I said to the assembled group at a meal the other day, I was an intern and it changed my life. So, and I want to start by apologizing for having to bring you back. And I will say, at the risk of getting emotional, one of the things that is so wonderful about being together, the number of times somebody came to the podium and said, this is the first time in 2 years that I have been in person. What is so wonderful about that is exactly what was happening here. That you can't do that on Zoom, right? You cannot have the sidebar conversation where you discover things, you invent things, you innovate in ways that are so powerful. And that's true in general in life, but it is especially true in something that is as ambitious and broad-ranging as this conversation that we're having, these conversations, right? Think about the number of disciplines, the number of issues that have been brought together, and which leads to my summing up the challenge that we face, which is the summary panel. And I guess the analogy I would use to build on something that David said, which is that we are all sort of feeling our way around the elephant, I guess I would offer a counter proposal, which is that we are feeling our way around a herd of elephants, which often feels like digitalization has the potential to overrun all of us, trample us. And I think the ambition I would have for this panel is that not that we map out that elephant, but that we begin to identify the elephants, both the ones that are in the room and that might not have been in the room for the last few days, and that we set ourselves in many ways an agenda for further work, right? Which are the themes that are emerging as the most important, and the ones that require our attention, that really cut across. That's the value of doing something like this, is you really begin to see those themes. So I'm going to start by asking our remarkable panelists, as they introduce themselves, to take on the issue of, first of all, what struck them as themes, the most important themes, both optimistic or pessimistic, but also what did we miss? And then I really want to turn to the discussion of, so what do we do about it, right? Maybe that's my bias as a policymaker, but not just what do we do as policymakers in government, but what do we do as academics? What do we do as designers? What do we do as citizens, individuals, in terms of the work that we would do out of this? So that, for an ambitious conference, is our ambitious goal. And I want to start with Seeta on my left.
Thank you so much, Shaun. And thank you to David and Chris, and to the Joint Center, to the other presenters and commentators for giving me this opportunity to share my reflections. I was commenting earlier on how this feels like very both unfamiliar and familiar territory. So I am based in the Media and Communications Department at the London School of Economics. My research focus is at the intersection of technology governance and social justice. So I look at issues of marginalization, surveillance, privacy, data and discrimination, and I feel like these questions about digitalization, or sometimes what we refer to in my field as datafication, another impossible word to pronounce multiple times, it feels very big, right? It feels vast. We've had sort of presentations that are looking at one side of housing, right? And I'm pointing to Ivan partly because I was really struck by your presentation and the ways in which you've thought about modularization and digitalization and data. And then on the other hand, we've had presentations or papers that are really focused, thinking about not that you weren't thinking about access and equity, but thinking sort of on the ground, sort of closer to the populations that are deeply affected by these issues. And that's a vast territory to cover. And it raises some interesting challenges. And what I'd like to say is that I guess what's been very generative for me is partly where we started in this question about ethics and impacts, and really thinking about whether ethics or an ethical framework or impact assessments are capacious enough to sort of deal with the challenges that these new technologies present to us. So that's sort of the generative point. I think my time is probably very well spent in identifying some of the gaps that I've seen or some of what I think is missing. And I want you to bear with me as I walk through this, because I'm going to start probably at a very high abstract level and then hopefully land on the ground, which is, kind of characteristic of the work that I do. So the first point that I want to focus on in terms of what I don't know, it's not the point was missing, but it's a focus of the conference overall. And it's this utilitarian view of technology. And so the question that I'm asking here is a utilitarian view capacious enough for us to be thinking about the relationship between digitalization and the home? And when we talk about a utilitarian approach to technology, we're talking about good and bad, promise and peril, opportunities and harms. And there's a different approach, partly informed by the work of people like Andrew Feenberg, who's a philosopher of technology based in Canada, who's talked about technologies as serving as the building blocks of our social world. And so they not only affect how we live our lives, but also change what we value in life. And so in this sense, technologies help to construct the very nature and structures of the social world, or what Feenberg refers to as social ontologies. I know that's a lot, but what I like about this perspective is that it allows us to go beyond thinking about good and bad uses of technologies. And so when we understand technologies as social practices, we acknowledge that they create particular possibilities of being or relating to others, while simultaneously diminishing or eliminating other fields of possibility. A sort of different way of condensing this is by saying, we deal with it, or inspecting, how do we deal with it, right? Or don't whine about it. Two phrases that I heard in this conference. So when we think about technologies as social ontologies and not as tools per se, it can be helpful as a conceptual starting point for understanding when we should emphasize the technology, study it, regulate it, and when we should, for example, decenter technology and give greater emphasis elsewhere. And I point to partly, Jennifer, you're not the only person that did this, but your paper comes to mind, just provoking us to think in that direction. The second point that I want to, and this will be, I think, hopefully shorter, that I want to raise is about thinking not only about data, but also computation. So the question of computation lurks behind questions of data, organizational or industry practices, data rights and wrongs. And I think as David and Chris's paper set us off thinking, right, the appetite for computation has increased dramatically. And so what that implies is that we ought not only be looking at questions of security, privacy, or surveillance, as I like to focus on, bias, right? But we also ought to be thinking about the outsized power that companies who are providing computational capacity, the outsized power that they wield. And I'd like to come back to a point that I think Ivan made in the last panel that was partly getting at this, right? Sort of what's the demand, what's driving our demand for these computational technologies and these tech-centered solutions. So what concerns me here is that computational service providers like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft are dictating the terms of innovation. And that's something to pause and think about, right? The implication is that for practitioners, regulators, scholars, and members of the public is that we're playing catch up, but we ought to be inspecting or reflecting, right? Is there a different way that we can approach innovation? Or do we want all of that innovation to be sort of concentrated within this domain of computational technologies or computational infrastructure? So how might we stimulate innovation in different ways? And then lastly, to a point that I did hear and was sort of inspired and heartened to hear around unadopters, conscientious objectors, we might call them, refusers or resistors, I like that play on terms. Right, and I think this is really an area worth probing further. So unadopters, conscientious objectors, refusers, those who refuse technologies, we have a lot to learn, a lot more to learn, and I think it would be really beneficial and generative to think about comparative analysis in this respect. And so we have, I think, historically paid attention to unadopters, right? In the sort of first iteration of the digital divide, NTIA led a number of studies, and they were looking very closely at those that weren't adopting the internet. Now it's broadband, next it will be cloud infrastructures, or
Metaverse.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that there's really value in looking at this very carefully, and I was really struck in part by Carlos's presentation paper, where you're thinking about, we were joking yesterday, this could be taken out of context, so I'm going to just put in the dumb people, right, in the smart technologies, right? But what I actually heard in some of that narration was there's something really potentially beneficial to gain from understanding why people don't adopt certain technologies and whether or not their practices are actually could inform the way we do policy, right? The way that we stimulate. I mean, sure, we could think about it as like, well, then how do you adopt the technology? But there's also the other case, which is how do you build upon people's norms and social practices in a way that gives us more insight as to contextually relevant interventions. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Whoa, lots to talk about. Carol.
Well, after that, I feel like the conversation that I had with my two sons who were philosophy majors as we were trying to get out the door for my nephew's wedding, and they were having a conversation about free will. And I was just like, put your socks on. It is time to go. No, what's interesting about Seeta's comments is I feel like one of the main points that I want to make is very similar, but came from the ground up as opposed to the theory down, which is just, I think, an example of my history is primarily as a developer of affordable and mixed income housing for many years, then trying to focus the frustrations I had in that world as a policymaker to try to make the policy context actually work for housing development. That's equitable, et cetera. And then more recently have been focused in academia and spent a lot of time on innovations in how we get in both policy and private sector and nonprofit work of how we, get farther around housing affordability issues. So I've kind of gone backwards in like how I approach this topic. So I would really just make two big points that came to me from this whole conference, which has been unbelievably great. And the first is I feel like we didn't spend as much time as I want to, at least in the future, not that it was the wrong thing to do for this setting, but actually talking about how we actually harness technology writ large for the better good of society. I think, and we started to really get to this in the panel that Jen and Carlos did, and in this last panel, but we spent a lot more time talking about how do we keep the forces that are out there, the companies that are out there, and the technologies that they're using from doing harm, and from how to get them to do better. And I would like to spend more time really addressing how do we access capital, talent, with intentionality to get to these positive outcomes, because the system really isn't set up for that to happen. And I think, you know, there's a variety of ways that come to my mind of how we might do that, which maybe we can talk about if we have time. But, you know, just off the top is, you know, we need to fund more research, you know, basic research in some of these areas with this intentionality. As government, maybe we need to create more incentives for the capital that comes in to these companies to be doing the right thing, whether that's, and I think it was Sarah Williams's, you know, how do you either can create that through government, or you can create that through a certification process, you know, for ESG, for example, or have a Community Reinvestment Act for, you know, technology and housing. Like, you know, there's a whole bunch of ways you can think about that. But right now, I'm really concerned that we're spending, you know, it's almost being a defensive move, trying to get existing players to do the right thing or to not do the wrong thing, versus thinking of, you know, using the technology to do what we really think needs to be done. So that's really my, you know, big point. I could talk a little bit more about, I think, some thoughts about how to get those players to be doing the right thing, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. The last big point, I guess my big takeaway is a feeling of validation that the lack of legible, I think that's a new word I learned here, instead of transparency, was legible and accessible data in the public sphere, or in a way that, you know, can be used for policy analysis, particularly in the housing markets, is simply absent. We don't have, again, a structure for collecting and analyzing a lot of this really, really important information for policy work. And so I feel like I've been saying that for a long time, and this was nice to hear other people saying it.
Great. Thank you, Carol. Vanessa,
So,
what movie should we be watching?
thank you. Has everyone watched Demon Seed?
Great.
Yeah, definitely got to watch that.
Joint Center Drive-In.
So my thoughts are shaped and informed by my background, my career starting out at Freddie Mac during the record earnings years, and working on some of the early formulations of automated underwriting. But my work there and goal there was to understand how we could expand access to mortgage credit for marginalized communities. Worked on related issues at CFPB, at HUD, so on the policy side, and now more recently at the Urban Institute's Housing Finance Policy Center, and in academia, where I actually teach in a department that is focused on government regulation and public policy, but is housed in a business school. So that kind of shapes what I am about to say. Now, I'm going to apologize because I've got yet another acronym. We've been talking about elephants since the beginning of the session, and so I actually have been thinking about pigs. And I think that what we have been doing as we think about regulation of digitalization and what we should be doing, and what I've heard in these sessions is more like putting lipstick on a pig. Pig standing for power, innovation, and the gathering of data. In terms of power, there's been a lot of conversations about the concentration of market power that occurs because, you know, digitalization means bringing a lot of data together, and so there's almost this kind of embedded monopoly kind of thing going on. And there's not much we can do about that. But what we can do is require that this market power be directed in ways that increase access. And we actually do have some regulatory frameworks that are designed to do that. I'm thinking about, you know, the Fair Housing Act and affirmatively furthering fair housing, and there's other examples. But could be these same kind of principles could be applied to things like access to Wi-Fi, access to sustainable energy, etc. There are examples of this, and that's what I think the regulatory efforts should be directed at, sort of focusing on. So in terms of innovation, one of the problems that we have is that, you know, there's no way that regulation can keep up with innovation. And as it stands, the innovation that is occurring solves some problems, somebody's problems, but not necessarily the public problems that those of us who are concerned about, you know, sort of public policy and public good would advocate. So what do we do about that? We create incentives for and mechanisms for innovation to solve the problems that we specify. And there's some reasonably good examples of that. I think about climate change sectors and what regulators have done in terms of, you know, demanding that companies reduce carbon emissions. You have to reduce them by X amount. They give them a time frame and say, if you violate this, you have to pay a fine, but figure it out. And what's happened, there's some evidence to suggest that using regulation in that way has both increased innovation. It's also resulted in, you know, fewer emissions, but it actually works because smart people will find a way to figure it out. In terms of gathering data, well, you know, we just can't stop this. You know, unfortunately, our privacy is being violated every day in so many ways, and to think that we can sort of opt out and be able to give these different companies and entities permission or not, that's just not realistic. That's just not realistic. My employer, George Washington University, requires essentially that I keep a GPS location on, at least while I'm on campus. Why do they do that? Because it's part of them being able to enforce the COVID protocols. So, you know, if you don't get tested and you don't, you know, do what you're supposed to do on a regular basis, then they lock you out, which means of the buildings, right? Which means that they have to know where you are. Now, I could take the time and turn off the GPS, but I don't do that. So they know where I am right now if they care. Should they be able to use my data for the purpose of the health of the community? I think that's absolutely appropriate. Should they be able to use that to measure my performance as a scholar or as a faculty member? Probably not. Don't want them to do that. And so what we should focus on is restricting the way that data are used, rather than thinking we can do something about the collection and combination, because I just don't think that that is ever going to be feasible. So I say all that to say maybe we should stop chasing the pig and focus on giving the pig a place to run. Feed the pig. Put a fence around the pig's area. But let the pig run around.
I'm sure we will have some debate about where the pig should live and be fenced. So really helpful framing comments. I have both a comment and then I want to jump in with an initial question on the what do we do about it. And for my comment, I want to pick up on Seeta's point which is something I think is the context in which we're operating here, but has not been explicitly stated and has huge implications for a lot of the discussions that we've had, which is that one of the consequences of our digitalization of our economy, it's not the only cause, but I think it is a primary cause, is that, I believe we're living in a time where we are largely urbanizing, not just locally, but globally. And I'm one of those who doesn't believe that COVID will reverse that. That tech has driven a new fourth industrial revolution, I think was the one term for it. And that the consequence of that is that information innovation is driving much of our emerging economic activity, and that activity happens where people come together like we're doing here and invent things, and that happens largely in cities. Surprising for a lot of planners that we thought maybe the devices would free us to move to the suburbs, but in fact, really what's happening is that we have an economic inequality that's come out of that, which has been compounded, I think, by geographic inequality. And a lot of the issues that we're talking about around housing affordability and segregation and housing searches and other things exist in this context. So a little bit, I hope to see this point, that whether these technologies, even if they are good in reducing friction, for example, in searches or buying housing, can actually have the impact of that reducing friction accelerates trends that were already happening in terms of housing affordability and gentrification and other things. And those kinds of trends mean that we have to look at these issues not just in whether these things are good or bad, but how do they interact? How do they change our gaze, perhaps? How do they focus us on new housing units that we might not have seen before, and thereby change the way that we operate? And I think that level of interaction requires that we really understand the context that we're operating in. And I'm concerned, for example, that we could do a lot on modularization and bring down the cost of housing, but unless you solve some of the zoning issues and others, all the benefit of that is going to accrue to the people who own the land rather than to the folks who are paying, 50% of their housing of their income toward housing. And so these interactions are ones that, from my perspective, haven't come up enough. We've had plenty to talk about, but they're a really important overlay in how we think about all the things that we're talking about. So let's jump into what do we do? Do we fence the pig? Do we let it loose? Do we? You're good at this, by the way. So let's just start with going back to the keynote that we had about ethics. And we heard a lot of frameworks. We heard a lot of calls for frameworks. And I think part of that is a focus on what is the private sector frameworks we ought to have. But I want to come back to a fundamental question, which I think each of the panelists has raised, which is, do we actually have the frameworks within public policy, within our laws, within our what already exists to be able to push these forces in the right direction? Or do we need new ways of regulating? And maybe to be a little bit provocative, we have a ethical framework that the country operates in. It's in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, and life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. There are lots of things we've talked about that fit under that framework. And one of the things I think is interesting in terms of what we've seen is that there are areas that we've talked about, health, green building, tech for building construction, that operate in areas that are heavily regulated. And we've had a lot of discussion in those areas, I think, about these could be very good for users, but adoption by jurisdictions, adoption by players in the market is hampered by regulation and other things that we need to change, whether it's zoning or many of the other things that we've talked about, right? Are people using smart thermostats? On the other hand, we have areas that are new to regulation, right? That we haven't really thought about before, particularly in terms of these issues about monopoly power in owning and using data, which comes up again and again, where maybe we don't have those tools yet. And so what I've been hearing is a focus on, in many of these areas where regulations already exist, they're heavily regulated, we desperately need more investment in innovation. We need to be government, academia, others doing more research, helping local planning organizations do more. That's thematically for me. Then on the other side, we hear companies and others that are putting tens of billions of dollars of capital into technological innovation. And the opposite problem, right? There's plenty of money, but not enough ethical framework in those areas. And so I guess what I'd want to do to start this is open up the question, do we have the tools, and is this just a question, and in which areas is it really a question of getting the money, getting the data into the hands of those who are regulating, and in what areas do we need to be thinking about new kinds of tools in privacy or in others? So how's that for a frame? Anybody want to jump in?
What was that?
I said you could start first this time.
Hopefully I wasn't being negative there.
No,
I just,
not at all.
I couldn't help the story that came to my mind. Yeah, I think this is tough. I would say in some sectors we have, I think climate tech, is a great example that was brought up. I think when we as a society decided climate change is a problem, and we're still deciding that, but we've at least decided to a degree that needs to be solved, and we have that agenda setting, therefore call to all kinds of companies to, as you said, solve the problem. I don't think we have that kind of overarching priority in any of the housing context pillars that we've been talking about here today. And, we have, the National House, you talk about the Constitution, we have the National Housing Act, which is, aspirational, but, just back to Nestor's comments about the Fair Housing Act and, how we, implement that, I don't feel like we have the tools to implement it well. The AFFH maps aside, not even close. And then we have the constitutional issues of race consciousness. So all of those things, in my mind, we would need to really set the priorities. We need to create the ethics, so to speak, or the values that as a country we want to pursue, and then create the innovation context to enable companies to flourish to make that happen.
Yeah. Although, to Nestor's point, we do have an affirmative obligation, at least, right, in housing, lots of problems on how to implement it. And I do wonder, given the discussions we've had, and maybe Seeta, this is one of your areas of specialization, the issues around privacy, and I would say one of the things that's really come out is the issues around trust, right? Devices, design of those interfaces, how the data is used, all those things go into not just privacy, but trust. do we have the tools there that we need, or do we need a new kind of compact or framework to be able to legislate on these and then to actually make change?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time kind of reflecting and conversing about sort of a normative shift within the field of computer science that would maybe get us closer to, I think, what you're talking about, right? There's a deficit within, within practice and within regulation and among the general public about technology and its impacts and what we want to do with these technologies. And I spend a lot of time, I get invited to these computer science conferences where I have to say, like, well, have you asked people whether or not they want this technology? Because most of my research is participatory and collaborative. And, usually the answer is no. And what it gets me thinking of is, yes, we have had some sort of promising developments within the field of computer science or data science where people are injecting civic values or sort of this sort of more public interested perspective. But I think we could do more, and that's partly a disciplinary obligation, right? If we're looking at optimization technologies and the logic of optimization, which is different from platform technologies and the logics of connection, right? There are lots of different things that get emphasized as a result. And I think that we could do a lot more to incentivize both the research and the practice that would get us to a point where civic values, it's not an add-on, but actually it's just something we do. So we don't have this problem where the FTC has been posting a job has a job posting for technologists for I don't know how many months now, right? I've seen it every time they get the notice from the Berkman Klein Center, right? Or that you go to any other agency and there's a deficit in including a sort of technologist perspective and that technical insight into the ways in which these agencies run. So I think there's that I think alongside of the research, right, is really important. It's a normative change, right, which is not anything that's easy to talk about at all. But that I think that's really lacking.
Yeah. Vanessa, you I think very helpfully the E in your scale builds on this conversation here, and again, to use the fair housing example, you at least have a obligation not just to stop discrimination, but to further fair housing. What are the ways in which you think, building on that and this conversation, that you could see placing an affirmative obligation toward equity into a lot places that we've talked about here, obviously in your area of specialization or in others as well?
That, so the E was expanded opportunity, and I think that's kind of what we're talking about. And when you talked about sort of the framework that we have embedded in the Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness actually doesn't really imply expanded opportunity. I mean, you can have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and be homeless. That, or be wherever you are or wherever your grandparents were, and there's sort of no notion of progress embedded in that particular statement. Now, then there's other parts of the Constitution that kind of go beyond that.
Amendments.
Amendments, right? Amendments. But so I think that the truth is, if we cannot make it a norm, right? Talking about a normative shift, it's standard that be at the sort of foundation of the design and the implementation of all digitalized tools. Granted, that wasn't in non-digitalized tools, but okay, let's pretend we're starting from scratch. Short of that, we'll just be tweaking, making amendments, and we've been doing that, and I mean, it's working okay, but it's not transformational by any stretch of the imagination.
I guess one of the things that's come up for me in hearing the presentations along these lines is, how much should we be thinking increasingly about data and computation as public assets? In the same way that water, our roads, there are many things that we and even our financial institutions, we feel that we can make them into utilities to a greater or lesser degree. Should we be thinking along those lines, and do we need to be pushing for a different way of regulating and thinking about data and information, and how would that play out in a range of these areas?
Yes, we should do that. And I think we have, you got to think about what are the levels, or what are the, again, highest priority things that you want to collect, and how hard is it to do it. But, we have HMDA, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, where you have, and I think Rob mentioned that yesterday, where there's a whole lot of information that gets disclosed. And this came up yesterday too. We don't have the same thing about rental data. We don't have, part of the problem with AFFH and gentrification and all these issues is, the census and American community surveys, are out of date the day you look at it. You can't keep up with it from a rent setting perspective, or from an affordability perspective, or from a demographic change perspective in a neighborhood, in any kind of really timely way. That's really critical to figuring out what is equitable development in an area, when you actually can't figure out who's already been displaced, and where gentrification already has occurred. And no disrespect to the urban displacement project, but it's not timely. It's not based. We don't have that public sphere. So I think we absolutely need to do that. I think the question becomes, like in healthcare, how you do that in a way that protects individual privacy. But on the other hand, I think having those systems is critical to make good policy decisions.
There's some discussion in Europe about things like public cloud, and there was a failed effort to design a public search algorithm or search infrastructure. And in general, I definitely see the value and think it's important to support these initiatives to sort of convey the sense that these are public resources, and they're, if we don't protect them, there's going to be a problem. On top of that, I think it's important. So there's I guess what I want to say is there's not only the technological innovation that's happened, right, with great speed, but also the financial innovations that have happened within the technology industry. And so I think that's actually a realm worth paying attention to. It's not only that we make money from data, or that technology companies make money from data. Yes, that's a large part of it. And yes, absolutely, privacy and data protection are important. And possibly we might be at a point in the United States where it's a little bit too late to rein it in. But we can turn to other places for examples. But technology companies make money by investing money, by financialization strategies. And so I think there's a lot of strategic thinking that needs to pour into that realm, and how we can think about, for example, incentives or redirecting the ways in which these investment strategies take place to the public benefit, right? And that feels underexplored right now. And so as we're thinking about new areas of digitalization in the home and quantum computing, maybe that's going to be part of the conversation, that we're not just thinking about the tool and its use, but sort of the larger edges of where innovation, or not even edges, the other domains where innovations are happening.
Yeah, I'm wondering kind of what that looks like, because I do believe that, the data and computational capability really makes a huge difference. It changes the game. And I'm thinking about, Carol's point about the HMDA data. HMDA data have been great because they do let you know who's getting mortgage loans from whom and where, and something about the characteristics of the household, but they actually don't include several key fields that you would need to be able to really measure the impact on the back end of the underwriting models that are being used for the loan decisions. And so what that means is the government, in all of its efforts to try to regulate this area and understand what's going on, actually doesn't have the data, but the private sector has the data. And there are companies and they charge rates that are so high that you know absolutely well that no one is ever going to pay them. And so, that kind of, but playing devil's advocate a bit, the companies that they have these proprietary algorithms and actually proprietary data sources. And if they share them, there goes their business model. So what will they sell if they make all of this publicly available?
Yeah. I would also say that probably in housing, more than in any other field, there's an enormous amount of data that comes from government and then gets privatized, right? And so if you go back up the chain from the property deeds to huge range, you could absolutely come at this in setting standards and requiring, and even in, say, mortgage data or others, because the government's such a big player, you have the potential for government standard setting in this that maybe is different from other fields.
Yeah.
So obviously, this is a conversation that, as I said, is beginning and ongoing. I want to open it up in just a moment to the audience. I want to bring one last question, though, which I think for me really began to emerge in the conversation this morning. We've talked a lot about the public sector and the private sector. We've talked less about, call it the civic sector, individuals, community organizations, movements that have been made possible by this technology, and began, I think, really to get into what are the ways in which the power of people can move these debates. And I think not, again, to go back to the optimist-pessimist framework, look at what's happening in Ukraine. And usually weaponizing isn't a positive term, but the use of technology, communications technology, digital media to really move the world it couldn't be more evident. On the other hand, we know that these kind of communications have debased and made it harder to have civic conversations in a lot of, and I'd love to hear some thoughts about what are the ways in which releasing data, affirmatively encouraging community organizations and others to participate can be a powerful part of this equation, which I think hasn't been as much the focus, but really came into focus this morning.
So I think this is probably one issues. I mean, every issue is complicated. This issue is complicated because, on the one hand, I think there is incredible power of bringing a whole variety of voices to the table. I actually had dinner last week with the head of the California Yimbys and said that, the pandemic was the best thing that ever happened to public participation. And no, seriously, now city council meetings, we're having housing element debate in my little community, and all the meetings are on Zoom, and everybody can line up, and you can eat your dinner, and look, until your turn comes up to make a comment. But and it's open to not just the residents of that community that have to get there, and so the YIMBYs are like lining up at the mic, on Zoom. So it's got incredible power. That's the good news. The harder thing for me is, and I was talking to some after the last panel, like, I'm not really, I'm just going to say it out loud. I know I'm going to get kicked out of the planning department or something. Oh, I'm already retired, so it's okay. I am for by right zoning, and I am for participation at the planning level, full stop. This negotiation is just not helpful to coming to consensus on what is the right thing to be doing, because it will be, at the end of the day, dominated. I don't care how much participation you have, it's going to be dominated by intracted interests. So I am for state preemption. Like we had to have federal preemption on civil rights. I mean, I'm for preemption when it's. My problem is I'm for preemption when it goes in the direction that I believe in, as opposed to Texas. So I'm just saying this is like really a conundrum for me, because I see the power, but I also see the challenges of regulating it in a way that leads to the outcomes that I think everybody in this room wants to see. So, and then
Very honest.
And then there's the issue of I was talking about my son, who works for one of these technology companies, who is trying to keep misinformation off the platform in Ukraine, and this is misinformation, fake news is a huge issue.
It's a thing.
It's a thing. It's the thing.
It is a huge thing, and often under-resourced within these companies. I think there's, I came to the topics of technology and justice by thinking about sort of affirmative ways that as communities we can participate and sort of govern the technologies that are available to us. So I still hold that optimism that you could be in the community and you can access certain tools, whether that's scraping tools or whether that's visualization tools or geospatial analysis, whatever it might be, that you can use that as part of your toolkit in crafting a narrative that then makes an impact in public decision making and power wielding, to be honest. And I do feel I'm still committed to that. We've seen different iterations of this over the years within the technology space, so civic technology, all of the open data enthusiasts. I think before that it was and this sort of reveals my political, indie media, right, was very active at a time when anti-corporate globalization was a bad word. So there's a lot to be said about sort of instilling a culture and instilling a hope that actually we can, as a civil society, both learn and engage and contest and or shape policy outcomes or the kind of world that we want to live in. It's vastly under-resourced and it's difficult to sustain. It often can devolve into sort of polarized politics, and yet I think there is some value. And honestly, I think it's the stuff that technology companies are not good at, and is, I think, important to maintaining our sort of democratic fiber, right? Like, we need that. We need that civic engagement and that sort of adversarial or contestatory action to sort of keep these technology companies and or power holders accountable, right, beyond the ethical frameworks, beyond the impact assessments.
Yeah, and I would just say from my perspective, having worked on these issues a lot at the federal level, we have a huge tradition in the US of understanding the ways that government data can actually create markets, from GIS data that comes from amazing government agencies and the work that they do, and also I think increasingly like releasing HMDA data did remarkable things for accountability, because anybody could, well, if you're trained enough, right, pick it up and do something with it and then organize people around it. I think the direction of what are the responsibilities and rules around non-government data are the things that I think have come up a lot here. And what can we and should we require? Do we have the legal tools for disclosing? And it's not just the data, as I think we've heard again and again. It is the algorithms as well that can be equally or even more important.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not just the algorithms or what's in the black box. It's actually the process, the decision-making process. I mean, I think Molly spoke to this in her keynote, where she was talking about Timnit Gebru and sort of the occasional, I would say occasional, but very spotlighted cases where within technology companies, staff members are sort of organizing, collectivizing in protest of decisions that are being made. But yeah, I think, sorry, I'm jet lagged and now I'm realizing, oh my God, I've just lost my point. It'll come back to me. But I think I wanted to say something like, anyway, come back to me.
Vanessa can help you out.
Yes,
So.
Come back to me.
I don't have jet lag, and I forgot what the question was. So,
Just really about the ways in which non-government, non-private sector actors can be powerful here. What do we need to do to help that?
So there's been, I'll say something optimistic, which is totally uncharacteristic of me. There, in the past couple of years, we have seen major global corporations take real stands about social justice in ways that I don't think we've seen in many years, if ever, before. And so, and they've done things like change their policies, change their hiring practices, change their product offerings. And so, but what was required was for them to take a stand. And they took a stand at a time when they were actually going against the, I don't want to say the dominant political paradigm, but certainly what was happening politically, who was in charge. They sort of stood up against that and said, no, this is not the way. We want to do things. And actually they've got, the power. So there's no reason that we can't hold, I don't even think we have to hold companies accountable. I think there's a movement for the private sector to take a stand and act accordingly. And so what we just need to do is sort of continue to expect that. And then, once, and they need guardrails, but if we keep trying to, chase them around, I mean, that's just not going to work. It just doesn't work. But I do think, so, I just can't imagine a world where we can make everybody reveal, all these private companies reveal their data in the way that they use them in models. I just can't imagine that ever happening. But what I can imagine is you can't use this for this. You can't discriminate. And what you need to do is expand opportunity in whatever the domain happens to be. You have to use these technologies in a way that makes people better off. And I think we can expect that. And I mean, we can demand that. I don't know that we can expect it, but we can demand that because it's happened or happening in other ways.
I remembered what I was going to say. there was a point that Molly made about whistleblowers. And I think we could do well in protecting and enhancing disclosure laws and whistleblowing laws. So that is really incredibly important, and a domain that will, I think, just kind of increase as people working in industry come to realize, like, oh, the values of my community or values of society are not aligned with the values of this company. So that's really, really important. This might be a small thing, but I'm partly looking at Nestor, I don't know why, but it's, in the world of privacy and data protection, there have been legal settlements that have then produced arrangements where either data become accessible, which is really important, or you establish, a foundation, for example, that then is required to support research on privacy and socioeconomic status, for example. And so that's a very small thing, but I think we could probably think, just much more broader than that. Sort of where are the inroads into sort of making that support for research and public access to data more promising.
Yeah. So I don't know how over 12:30 we're going to go, but we've got 20 to 30 minutes for conversation. I'm sure lots of interest in jumping in. Yep.
Thank you. I feel like jumping because I just cannot sit in more different places of postures given what I've heard on the panel today. I don't have a question, I have more of a comment, and I think it's a cry for help at this point. So I have a case study. This is based on a very real situation. A good friend of mine started his PhD in this nameless university down the road. And he wanted to create this, he was into energy, environment, and simulation from a computational perspective, and he wanted to create a similar tool to what we've seen before, this kind of web app where you can find your unit, where do you live, in a 3D map, click on it, and then get some recommendations about what the energy consumption of your unit is and how can you retrofit it to make it more energy efficient. And then what he did was he was trying to gather a database of, he was using New York City as a case study. He was trying to gather a data set of all the units that are in New York City, and there's public data about what they're made of, brick, like the year they were built, et cetera, which it's very important for simulations. But then he also needed information about energy consumption, so the electricity bills and the gas bills. He reached out to energy companies, providers, to request this information, and surprise, surprise, he got denied this information because you cannot give individual information about an unit's consumption of energy, because that could be used as a weapon, to your point before, for example, to single out which units are not used or which units are vacant, and like go and rob them, or like have the neighbors angry about it, whatever, right? The best he could do was to gather aggregated data per whole block, just the whole block, all the energy consumption of that. And then he had to come up with all these methods to reverse engineer and to come up with Bayesian models and all these crazy stories to like reverse engineer that data so that he could distribute it with an estimate model across all those units. It was such a complicated thing that he ended up doing his PhD just in this model, the reverse engineering of the aggregated data for the energy consumption of New York City. This, to me, represents the conundrum that you are trying to discuss, which is the idea that one of the brightest minds that I know had to spend 5 years making an estimation that could have totally been done by just a couple clicks in the right place, you know? So his contribution was just a pure estimation of a real data set that is out there, but that we cannot really release for a variety of reasons. It's a very complicated topic. I'm not sure what the answer to these questions are. Probably to your point, to the points that you're trying to make in your discussion. But we need help because I think in this forum, I'm kind of representing the technology side of people, the computation kind of side of people. There's a lot of people out there with the skills, with the knowledge, and with the will to help and to contribute. But we need some, I don't know if it's policy making, law, like government, I don't know what it is, but there needs to be a framework that we all agree to make all this data accessible. And there have been attempts. There's the plan for artificial intelligence and research development strategic plan from 2016 with the revision in 2019. It says that the government is willing to make efforts to make data more accessible, but how is that going to happen? It's been in the works for 6 years already, and we still haven't seen that. What are your thoughts, especially many of you who have had a very strong positions in the government and in policy making? How is this going to change?
So I'll start because I have a very personal story about this. The building data that you're talking about, when I started as housing commissioner in New York, the person who led code enforcement for my team very proudly took me down to the basement and showed me the iCards. These were literally index cards on paper that had all of that information. And so one of the projects we took on during my time as housing commissioner was to digitize all that, or digitalize. Did we digitize it or all of that data? But to me, this highlights two issues. One is, I think, the point I was making before, which is government data is one thing, right? The standards about what you do with data that is in private utilities or private companies of other kinds is something that we have done, I think, less good work on. And my view would be, of one of the elephants we ought to take out of this conference and work on is, how do you start to set real standards? The other thing I would say, though, is from my work in government, the broad distrust that we have in institutions, start there, government, particularly federal government, and about this issue in particular is driving a whole bunch of bad policy making, right? That the ability to do disclosure, to get access to data, there is a deep lack of trust about what that data will be used for that I think is human. But one of the things that for me was very powerful about this discussion is that for me, I went from thinking about privacy to transparency to legibility, but also that designers and others have a role, policymakers, in building trust around how that information is used. Because if we don't do that, I don't think we're going to change the larger politics around data disclosure and privacy in ways that we really do need access to that data. And I on both extremes of the parties, I think those issues are being kind of weaponized in ways that I worry about.
I don't want to dismiss the sort of starting point of what you present, but I guess a lot of what I spend my time doing is asking technologists, right? Like, have you, again, asked the community whether this tool is necessary? Now, not in this case, it might not necessarily be appropriate, but I think there's some value in asking, do we need the technological tool to arrive at an awareness of a problem and to be able to solve that problem effectively? And I partly say that because as I was listening to the last panel, one theme came out for me, which is do facts or does information necessarily advance, fair housing or fair and equitable housing, right? I mean, are there cases where that information becomes deeply politicized right away, but the point is, do we always need a tool, a technological tool to arrive at a point where, yes, we could achieve some degree of energy smartness in our consumption habits, for example. So yeah, it's not to dismiss the problem. I mean, I think there are many, right, like that's a real problem that is very common, and it's very tricky. I wouldn't necessarily want to be in that policy position deciding that, but because, you know, my first inclination is to say that, well, it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, but which is completely impractical from a policy perspective. So, yeah, the question that I have kind of precedes all of that, to ask, like, is this really the right path towards the outcome that we're trying to get at?
So, like Jose, I'm also bursting with. So I'm a founder of a company that's focused a lot on letting the pigs run free, and you know, I've kind of sat through these amazing discussions of technology and obviously so many of the rights issues and accessibility issues that we have. But fundamentally, it seems, you know, we only talk, the furthest we get is talking about the financialization of data. We don't actually talk about the consumerization of data and what that would really mean. For 100 years, since the founding of the MLS in 1867, consumers have not owned their own data, their own home data. It's their home. They don't have control over how their data is used, or the appraisal process, which is, by the way, run by 98% white men. Right? Brokers and appraisers are a complex institution. It's a religion in this country, real estate. But we're not really getting to the core of what that means. And so what would it mean to create a new trust graph for consumers from the bottom up as opposed to the top down? Right? Everything here has been focused very much on regulation, AI and the ethics of AI and its application to consumers. What would it mean for consumers to have access to these tools themselves? Why are we so afraid of giving consumers access to these tools? I think there's a lot of things that we can do and a lot of technologies that are being implemented and put in the market today. Not just the ones that I'm creating, but stuff around ownership, right? Crypto, which has never been mentioned once in this room in the past 2 days, is fundamentally a mechanism not only for speculation and financialization, which it is for sure, but it is also the capability to actually innovate on ownership. What does it mean to change the way we think about ownership from the ground up, incorporated into our houses? Whether it's owning them as digital assets and understanding the fractionalization of those digital assets, or looking at them as securities that can be actually improved upon and split and allowed different people to fund them in different ways. There are so many ways that we could talk about innovation at the consumer level, from the bottom up. And so the elephant in the room, in my opinion, is we have not discussed it once, right? Jose maybe have touched upon it a little bit. I heard some of the stuff yesterday on aging in place that touched it a little bit. Modularization may be because it affects affordability. But we really don't talk about the opportunity to create transparency and legibility in the home from the consumer's perspective. And that is a building block towards reckoning with the MLS NAR cartel. I know there's 3 DOJ lawsuits about it, and I know that just even a few weeks ago, the NAR pushed back and got the founder of Rex or Redfin, I can't remember which one of those guys, to actually take back the word cartel, so I hope they don't sue me. But we have to recognize that there's a fundamental monopoly that has resisted innovation at the consumer level in this country for 100 years and is primarily responsible for segregation, redlining, from the GI Act in 1953. So it's time to have a reckoning in academia, as well as certainly in the real estate industry. I'm sorry Mike Del Prete left, because he doesn't see this, but certainly this is where Desiree's work has been focused as well. So I want to say, let's address some of the elephants in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, not necessarily endorsing everything I just heard, but the spirit of it, and also Seeta has brought it out, and a number of people have brought it out here and there. But this is, and I appreciate everything I've heard in the last 2 days, and the idea that you can regulate and that you can make policies that can improve what we have and incorporate digitalization. The elephant, I think it's the same elephant, but might be a different elephant, or might be the cousin of the elephant that I'm thinking about, is related to consumers, and that's citizens, ordinary people. And when we talk about technology, there's 2 ways to look at that. One is the old-fashioned way of just saying, how are people behaving? Why are they doing what they want to do? What is their decision-making process? And that affects everything we've been talking about, mortgage, and Carlos knows about this because it's a lot about what are you going to do, what kind of energy habits are you going to adopt, and so on. But people are making decisions, and they're using technology in different ways. So the 2 levels are understanding that we stop a little bit and add to all the reforms that we're talking about. What are people's habits already? Why are they making the decisions, and what are the factors incorporating them? And then finally pushing it a little further, just as others have been saying, what are ways that people can use new technology to further their own interests? And I'm thinking about people, working class people, of color, or maybe even not of color, but immigrants, people of all sorts. How could they use these technologies, which I think you've hit here and there, but the first thing you have to do is talk to them and find out what are their interests and what is their thinking. And I know a lot of the people here in the room are sophisticated, but I'd say that's an elephant that needs to be incorporated.
Thoughts on that? From these 2 comments?
So I really appreciate the comment that we haven't gotten to the core of, what the consumer wants, and how the consumer can use the technology, and how we can change how ownership happens, through technology, all of that. And I think it's a really, really fair point. I think one of the reasons, at least I haven't focused there, even though some of the housing lab companies I work with do focus there, is that it partly goes back to who really gets to use this technology, who's going to benefit, and where is the line? It's not even a privacy issue, but where is the line between kind of taking advantage of people's desire, for example, to own a home with a product that may be technology enabled, but at the end of the day, it might be just as predatory as what we did in 2005, without regulation. So that's partly why my mind goes to thinking about regulating the industry, and I totally agree about regulating the buying and selling industry differently has potential, but we have to make sure that we're actually whatever new is emerging to take the place of the old regime. We have to be sure that it is appropriate, from a fair housing perspective, from an accessibility perspective, from all kinds of perspectives, and so that's why I think at least my head goes to the need to have some regulation around these things, because we've seen what happens when we don't have regulation.
Just to make clear, reform of data is not the same thing as reform of transaction. Right? We're not going to change the transaction that we have characteristics in the industry. We can work on the data characteristics and the ownership of the data. They're separate things. I think it's very important that we understand transaction is not critical to what housing and homes are.
Vanessa, you want to say anything on this?
I just want to kind of agree with Carol. I'm not sure I fully understand, but I'll say that I worry about anything that places a burden on consumers to try to disentangle what might be happening to them. Consumers are tired. I don't mean existentially tired. I mean like right now, tired. There are just so many things that people have to sort of keep track of and try to protect themselves from and be aware of and screen and filter and all of that. And while I think people should have choices and agency and access to data, I certainly wouldn't want to create a situation where if they were too busy to have to attend to these things or try to sort through them, they would be placed at further disadvantage.
And I guess I would just quickly say, I do think, and I want to give credit to a bunch of the authors, that there has been a fair amount of conversation about the user, how it changes the experience in the home, around aging, around energy, around how homes are built, and how that impacts. To me, maybe there's a sort of implicit that people are voting with their feet, right? The adoption of these technologies is not in question. We're not here to whine about it. We're here to say, what do we do about it? And I think to some extent that's human beings have chosen to use this technology in ways because it has benefits to them, right? But I think what we have brought out is an unequal access to that, which can not only perpetuate but compound inequality in our society. That's something I care deeply about, right? But also, I do think it's important to frame, there are areas that we've talked about where regulation may be impeding innovation, right? And there are places where government should do less. I think we've talked about some of those things. And then there are other places I think we've talked about where government should do more. So I don't want to leave this conversation like, you know, I do have a government perspective. I've done a lot of regulating in my life, but I think it is also a fair point that there are places where innovation is being hampered. Modularization is a good example. Some of the green technology is a good example where I would advocate for doing less in certain places too. So,
can I just make one other quick comment? I know we're running out of time, but you know, on the ownership of your own data, I mean, I'd really like to understand that more. But I think about things like, you know, I've been calling for, say, a rent registry. There are apps that allow you to essentially crowdsource all the rents in a building and go complain to your landlord about discrimination, or, you know, there's a whole you do own certain, maybe jointly own certain data, but on a home ownership basis, you know, like the system, whether it's through blockchain or through title companies, I mean, you know, there's a public benefit to understanding, you know, there's a whole regulatory system of what it means to own a piece of real estate, and you can change that system perhaps, but like it's really key to, you know, property rights is to have a set of regulations around that, and banks have to have control over some of that data if they're making you a mortgage. So I guess I'm still trying to understand, and we can talk later, but I'm still trying to understand like what data you don't have control over as a consumer that you need.
Can we get one more in?
Yeah.
Somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. I thought I saw a hand up. Sorry.
Well, you know, I had it and then I put it in my backpack. So, yeah, I read somewhere every Harvard event has to end with 4 white men giving comments, and then you're, you know, you just call it a day. 2 comments. One is, I think the planning. How do we reshape the housing system? There's the planning front end, like conceptual. I do all this stuff in scenarios, and then there's the advocacy, top-down, statewide TOD, developer remedy. So I think my Carol's comment, my light bulb was they obviously complement each other, right? And so it's not an either or. Like we in the room work on different ones, but work done in one area reshapes then the planning conversation, vice versa. So that was but that was a kind of thought. And then my second comment's really speaking to the Joint Center, us as a group. Where do we go from here? And one thought was kind of towards a data infrastructure for fair, inclusive, sustainable housing, right? Where a lot of the pieces have been mentioned, but it's fragmented even for me. Like I'm supposed to be the one that already has the map in my head of HMDA and energy data and all of it. And so that's like that report I would read. And I think in a kind of relatedly, the other one would be better coordination between, I'm in this place-based planning discourse, but then there's the federal scale, and I think affirmatively furthering fair housing kind of sits in the middle. LIHTC, how do we geographically target LIHTC, opportunity zones? It's kind of a lens of data in place about how do we coordinate those things? And this relates to Vanessa, all of your thoughts about, you're an expert in the mortgage industry side, and I'm very intrigued by how do we align that more with the metropolitan planning objectives. And I know how dysfunctional it is. I told you I look at the map, but I'm not at the table thinking about your insights about what could HMDA be or what's behind the scenes where we need to intervene and having that cross fertilization. So Joint Center, I think, well situated to pursue both of those. Take it or leave it, and thanks for a great event.
On that note.
And yet another white man. Well, trying to put a benediction on this is not easy. I said at the beginning that this was an ambitious event, ambitious symposium. It was ambitious in scope, in terms of the domains we covered, in terms of the concerns we were dealing with, and in terms of the perspectives we brought to the table. And I got to say, at times I worried we created a hot mess. And maybe we did. But sometimes hot messes are really valuable. And I found the last couple of days to be really enormously provocative and generative. And a lot of it is because of that diversity. It's when if you're kind of in your box and you think about things from the perspective it's easy. But you look across realms, it challenges you. You look across the scale of things you're worried about, and then you add new perspectives. And this last couple of days have really been, I think my thinking's evolved more than it has since the pandemic, for sure. Not as much
since you were born.
Since I was born. Not much of this happening in my basement the last 2 years. And that said, I will also say that the diversity of perspectives we have here is really kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? So we've got some planners and some lawyers and some economists, and we've got architects, right? And that's felt challenging, but we didn't have very many people from the business sector. And it's really easy for us to sit here and kind of beat up on those folks and all that they're doing, right? But that would have been a pretty engaging conversation to have had the iBuyers here, right? And the investors, and they would have challenged us more. And of course, we don't really have anybody from the community that we're talking about, the community. And so we got more work to do on that front, but I think that the Joint Center strives to be a platform for diversity. And I think this last day and a half, 2 days, was really indicative of why you should do that. When we've done these symposiums in the past, it's been easy. We had the papers, we got the discussants, you go back, you polish your paper, we put a bow on it, we put a cover on it, great job. And we're going to do that here too. But I feel like we're really much closer to the beginning than the end of a process. As I said at the beginning, this was a symposium that was kind of outside the box for us because it's topics that we're not necessarily experts on. Seeta, maybe the only person in the room, was a technology expert. And so, it's been really helpful for us to do that. And so I think in the medium term, what we're going to have to do is figure out, to Rob's points, how do we build on this and where do we go from here? The origin of the symposium was in the recognition that digitalization is revolutionizing housing, and that we need to kind of understand it more to be able to know what to do about it. And I think what we've proven is it is revolutionizing housing, and it is a way in which, from where I'm sitting, my perspective, my tools, my perspectives aren't up to understanding how it's changing it. So I think we've had a conversation about kind of what does the public sector do, what does the civic sector do, and there's new things they need to do. So I think that's really where the Joint Center needs to head is how do we think about how these things are changing, what do we need to know, who do we need to engage? I feel like we've got the beginning of a community here. So I hope that this isn't just a one-off connection, but the beginning of a beautiful relationship. And you bring your friends. and you bring your friends' friends. So that's kind of on me to think about how do we build on that. But I just want to thank all of you who are still here on Saturday, engaged and thoughtful and sharing and provoking, because it's really been a great couple of days. And I just want to thank you. And of course, to thank all the people who made it happen, Matt and Brian and James and Abby and Sophia, Ellie, Alex, David. And I guess I didn't thank the panel. And thank this last panel. I told Shaun, it's like, I can't figure out how to wrap this up. I'm going to give you that job. You did a great job leading that panel. I really thank all the panelists, too. It was a great way to end the event. So thank you all. Be well, be safe, and I hope to see you soon.